Assalamualaikum and hello again everyone. So this topic will cover on cluster analysis, the first part. First thing first, let us take a look at the predictive analytics. If you still remember, on last semester we have learned on analytics, right? So the third phase of analytics would be predictive analytics. There are previous there are various methods on predictive analytics. One would be on classification, and then we also learn on basic idea of what is clustering, and there are also association, rule mining that will fall under predictive analytics. There's a lot of other methods that has been introduced in the first chapter as well. You may revise them again, okay? So the objective of this slide today is to introduce the basic concept of clustering, to discuss how to compute the dissimilarity between objects for different attribute type, and then we are going to examine several clustering techniques that are partitioning methods and also hierarchical methods. So what is cluster analysis? Cluster analysis is basically we are finding group of objects. We have object, we need to find their own group such that the object in a group will be similar to one another and different to the object in another group. So if you say that it is similar, if the object is similar, so that means it is related. Similar to another object, meaning that it is related. For example, this is this one and this one, it is related. And also you have dissimilar, or we can say that it is different from the another object. Okay, so meaning that it is different, so it will be formed into another group. So this one can be considered as dissimilar or unrelated. So we can say that when you have a similar object, okay, this one would be similar and will be clustered together, and those with unrelated value, okay, dissimilar or different value, will be considered into different clusters. When you are forming the clusters, the same clusters would have intra-clusters distance that are minimized. Where meanwhile, when you have different clusters between this one and this one, the intercluster distance are maximized. So the concept of clusters, or the meaning of cluster, is it is a collection of data object, whether it is similar or it is dissimilar between the another data. So when it is similar or it is related, meaning that it is related to one another within the same group, where dissimilar is unrelated to the object to another group. In cluster analysis, what you have to do is basically you are finding the similarities between data according to characteristic. So you have to bear in your mind about this one, characteristic. Found in data and grouping similar data object into clusters. So the similarity you will be find it based on the characteristic here. So what is the characteristic? So possibly it can be your attribute, the value of your attribute. So clusters sometimes can be called as unsupervised learning. Why? Because it does not have any predefined classes. If you still remember, in classification, you have one class value here, right? Class label here. You have few attributes and one would be considered as the class label. Okay, so this is the one that we say as predefined classes. But now, in cluster or in cluster analysis, we will not be having any class anymore. So meaning that all of the attribute will be the X attribute, no more class attribute. So the characteristic will be based on all of these attribute, the X attributes here. The typical application of clustering would be as a standalone tool to get insight into data distribution, and also usually clustering can be used as a processing step for other algorithm. These are the application of clustered analysis. For example, clustering precipitation in Australia, and also understanding the group of related document for browsing, group genes and protein that have similar function, or you can also have group stock with similar price fluctuation for your clusters. When you talk about clustering as a processing tool, so you have three types here. One would be summarization, compression, and also finding k-nearest neighbor. When clustering is being used as a part of summarization, meaning that it will reduce the size of large data set into a smaller size. It can be also used in processing for regression, principal component analysis. This is principal component analysis, classification, and also association analysis. What you have to understand, clusters can be used when you want to pre-process classification and also association analysis later on. Clustering can also be used in compression. For example, you apply the clustering into image processing. Okay, so you are going to have those factors, quantization. You can also find the k-nearest neighbor. If you see k-nearest neighbor is a part of classification, where you use the clusters to localize searching to one or a small number of clusters. When you talk about clustering for understanding, for data understanding and application, these are the application that can be used using clustering. For example, we have biology, we have information retrieval, we use cluster in land use, and so on. These you can read by your own later on here. So what is not cluster analysis? What are the characteristics that the method that cannot be considered as cluster analysis? One is when you have supervised classification, or you have the class label information there. Whenever you have those, why this one cannot be considered as cluster analysis? Why? Because in cluster analysis, you are only need those attributes without the class label. Next is when you are going to do the simple segmentation. For example, you are dividing students into different registration group alphabetically, meaning that you have known, okay, I would like to divide this according to their alphabet, okay, or their last name. So this is not called as cluster analysis, because when you're doing the clusters analysis, you don't know what exactly value that you are defining, or you don't know what is the class label there. Next is when you want the result of a query. So this is not considered as cluster analysis. Why? Because it is a grouping based on the external specification. What is the external specification? It is based on your query. Next is graph partitioning, where some mutual relevance and synergy, but areas are not identical. However, when we talk about cluster analysis, notion of a cluster can be ambiguous. If we take a look at this data set, okay, you consider each point is called each row, one row or one sample or one example, okay? So these represent one row or one example or one sample, okay? How many clusters, okay? How many clusters that you can see? If you take a look at the similarity or the dissimilarity, if it is like the distance is near, we can say that it is in the same cluster, right? So you can see, for example, possibly two clusters. Okay, one would be from here, another one would be from here. These clusters and these clusters. But then some of you may say that, oh, okay, I think it would be in 6 clusters. One is from this one. Okay, let me change the ink color first. See, one would be this cluster. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here, because it seems like the distance is very similar compared to these two clusters. Or also we can say that, oh, okay, I think we have 4 clusters. It can be, right? Because the notion of the clusters is very ambiguous. So for example, if you have 4 clusters here, take a look at this. You can say that this one will fall under one cluster, this is another cluster, this is another cluster, and this is the 4th cluster. So this is what we call as ambiguous. So there are 2 types of clustering method, where a clustering is a set of clusters. An important distinction between hierarchical and partitional set of clusters. So there are differences between these two, partitional clustering and also hierarchical clustering. When you talk about the partitional clustering, the G's of this partitional clustering is when you want a division data object into non-overlapping subset, meaning that your clusters cannot be overlapped in a way that each cluster has exactly one subset. Each data object is belong to exactly one subset. However, in hierarchical clusters, you may have those overlapping subset, and it is a set of nested clusters organized as hierarchical tree. So this is the original point when we say that we are doing those partitional clustering. We won't have any overlapping subset, so we say that each object will belong to one cluster, so that there will be no overlapping here. So this one would be the partitional clustering. However, if we have those hierarchical clustering, okay, hierarchical clustering, they may be overlap here based on the dendrogram. So you have 2 types of dendrogram. One would be traditional hierarchical clustering using traditional dendrogram, and the second one is non-traditional diagram that will give you a non-traditional hierarchical clustering. So what is a good clustering? A good clustering method will produce high quality clusters, meaning that you are going to have high intra-class similarity. Intra-class is between the classes, yeah. The cohesiveness between object in the cluster. So you have few objects, okay, you have few objects inside a clusters. So the cohesiveness between the clusters. So this is the clusters, for example. So this is the next cluster here. So you need to have low interclass similarity. So between this and this, you need to have low interclass similarity. You cannot have very high similarity between this object to this object that belongs to another cluster. So we can say that distinctive between the cluster. The quality of clustering method depends on the similarity measure used by the method, and also the implementation of the method and its ability to discover some or all of the hidden pattern. Because when we talk about clustering, we don't know what exactly the category that we want, right? So we need to find those hidden pattern by ourselves. So these are the measures of quality of clustering. One is the similarity and similarity matrix, and also the quality of clustering here. Okay, similarity is expressed in terms of distance function. So if you want to calculate the similarity, you need to understand the distant function. So typically the metric would be dij. The definition of this distant function are usually rather different for interval scale, Boolean, categorical, ordinal, and also vector variable. So you have to bear in your mind those functions are different for every type of variable. Weights should be associated with different variable based on the application and the semantic. So you need to consider what application or what data semantic that you are using so that you can get the high quality of clustering to get the dissimilarity and the similarity metric. So the quality of clustering, there is usually a separate quality function that measure the goodness of cluster, but it is hard to define a similar enough or good enough. And the answer of getting how enough is enough, okay, how similar or how good is it, the answer is typically very subjective or highly subjective. These are the typical requirements of getting a good clusters. One is when you have scalability, meaning that you can do it in a small to large data set, all of the cluster methods into a small data set and also large data set. When it applied to small, it can be good. When it being used in large data set, it can be good as well. And then it is able to deal with different type of attribute. You can also need to have discovery of clusters with the arbitrary shape and the minimum requirement for domain knowledge to determine the input parameters. For example, the number of clusters that you are going to have. Also, if it is a good cluster analysis, it need to be able to deal with noisy data. It also need incremental clustering and insensitive to input order. It can also deal with high dimensionality, meaning that you have very high attribute or very high dimension. And also you need to have constraint based clustering, for example, number of customer per clusters. And also it need to be good in terms of interpretability and also usability.